The carriage wheels crunched over gravel as Rosalind Harper approached Thornwick Hall through the mist-shrouded moorlands of Yorkshire, 1878. She had accepted the position sight unseen, a desperate governess fleeing scandal in London, hired by a reclusive duke whose reputation preceded him like a winter storm. The servants whispered of closed wings, forbidden corridors, and a master who hadn't smiled since his wife's death 5 years prior. But nothing prepared her for the moment the carriage door opened, and she saw him standing in the doorway, the Duke of Thornwick, Lord Nathaniel Ashford, his storm-grey eyes holding such profound devastation that her breath caught. Behind him, a small figure darted into shadows. His daughter, the child no governess had managed to reach in 3 years. As Rosalind stepped onto the frost-covered ground, she understood. She hadn't been hired to teach. She'd been hired to perform a miracle. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has travelled. The November wind howled across the Yorkshire moors as Rosalind Harper's modest travelling case was carried into the grand entrance hall of Thornwick Hall. The interior matched the desolation outside. Magnificent bone structure draped in neglect. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, filtering through towering windows, desperately in need of cleaning. Holland covers shrouded furniture like mourning shrouds, and portraits of long-dead Ashfords stared down with aristocratic disapproval. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was a spare woman of 60 with iron-grey hair and a mouth set in permanent disapproval. She surveyed Rosalind with barely concealed skepticism as they stood in that cavernous hall, their voices echoing off marble floors. "You're the 23rd governess in 3 years, Miss Harper," Mrs. Pemberton announced without preamble, her Yorkshire accent clipped and precise. The last one lasted precisely 11 days before fleeing in the night. The one before that made it to 3 weeks, though she spent the final 4 days locked in her room, refusing to emerge. Rosalind kept her spine straight, despite her exhaustion from the long journey north from London. At 26, she was older than most new governesses, with auburn hair pulled severely back and intelligent hazel eyes that had seen more of the world's cruelties than her modest appearance suggested. "I assure you, Mrs. Pemberton, I'm not easily frightened. It's not fear that drives them away, miss." The housekeeper's expression softened marginally. "It's heartbreak. The child, Lady Catherine, she's 8 years old and hasn't spoken a word since her mother died. His Grace, the Duke, well, you'll see soon enough." They climbed the grand staircase, passing more portraits. Rosalind paused before one, a luminous blonde woman with sapphire eyes, captured in the full bloom of youth and beauty. Her smile was radiant, her evening gown the palest blue silk. "The late Duchess," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly. "Lady Eleanor. She died in childbirth with the second child. Lost them both, the babe and herself, in the same terrible night. His Grace found them at dawn. Something in him died that day as well." Rosalind's throat tightened. She understood loss intimately. "And Lady Catherine witnessed this?" "No, thank Providence, but children sense things, don't they? The grief, the change." His Grace withdrew entirely, locked himself in the East Wing for 6 months. When he finally emerged, he was altered, cold, unreachable, and little Catherine had stopped speaking entirely. The schoolroom was located in the South Wing, mercifully well lit with large windows overlooking overgrown gardens that had once been magnificent. Books lined the shelves, slates and chalk sat unused on desks. A globe gathered dust in the corner. Evidence of previous governess's efforts, primers, art supplies, musical instruments, lay abandoned like archaeological artifacts of failed campaigns. "Lady Catherine takes her meals here," Mrs. Pemberton explained. "She rarely leaves this wing. His Grace visits her each morning for precisely 15 minutes, though neither speaks. He inquires about her welfare to whomever currently serves as governess, receives a report, then departs. He hasn't touched her, not an embrace, not even a hand upon her shoulder, since the Duchess died. That's barbaric, Rosalind said before she could check herself. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes flashed with something like approval. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's all a broken man can manage. Your room adjoins the schoolroom. You'll take your meals here as well, unless His Grace specifically requests your presence, which I assure you, he will not. You are to provide Lady Catherine with education appropriate to her station, deportment, French, music, needlework, basic mathematics, history, geography. You are not to allow her to wander the estate unsupervised. You are not to enter the East Wing under any circumstances. And you are not to disturb His Grace with complaints or requests for guidance. So I'm to civilize a traumatized child while navigating a crumbling estate, entirely unsupported by her only living parent. Rosalind's voice carried an edge she didn't bother to conceal. Those are your terms of employment, Miss Harper. If you find them intolerable, I can have Dobson prepare the carriage for your return to the station immediately. Rosalind thought of London, of the scandal that had cost her her previous position, of the vicious rumours spread by Lord Ashworth's wife when Rosalind had rejected his advances. She thought of her empty purse, her lack of references, her ageing mother in Bath, who depended on Rosalind's income for medicine. She thought of the desperation that had driven her to answer an advertisement for a position in Yorkshire, asking no questions about salary or conditions. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "When do I meet Lady Catherine?" "She's in the garden, or what's left of it. You'll find her by the fountain, the only place she goes besides this room and her bedchamber." Rosalind descended through the servants' entrance and emerged into the November chill. The gardens of Thornwick Hall sprawled across several acres, divided by hedgerows grown wild and pathways choked with weeds. In the distance, she could see the skeletal remains of a once magnificent rose garden. The pergolas collapsed under the weight of unpruned vines. She found the fountain at the garden's heart, a marble Neptune surrounded by dolphins, the basin dry and filled with dead leaves. Beside it sat a small figure in a dark blue woolen dress, her blonde hair hanging in two neat plaits down her back. Lady Catherine was staring at something in her hands with fierce concentration. Rosalind approached slowly, her boots crunching on gravel. The child didn't look up. "Lady Catherine, my name is Miss Harper. I'm your new governess." Silence. The child's fingers moved over the object she held. A small wooden box, Rosalind realized, intricately carved. Rosalind settled onto the fountain's edge, maintaining a respectful distance. "That's a beautiful box. May I see it?" For the first time, Catherine looked up. Her face was heart-shaped and delicate, her features a miniature echo of the portrait Rosalind had seen, the late Duchess's daughter, unmistakably. But whereas Eleanor Ashford had radiated warmth, Catherine's blue eyes were windows into winter, empty, distant, old, beyond her years. The child studied Rosalind for a long moment, then returned her attention to the box without responding. "I won't force conversation," Rosalind said gently, "but I will sit here with you, if you'll permit it." The gardens must have been spectacular once. They sat in silence as grey clouds rolled across the moors and the first drops of rain began to fall. Rosalind expected Catherine to flee indoors, but the child remained motionless, rain darkening her dress, her face turned toward the sky as if welcoming the cold baptism. "Catherine!" A man's voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the rainfall. Rosalind turned to see him, the Duke of Thornwick himself, striding through the overgrown garden with a great coat billowing behind him. He was tall, perhaps 35, with thick, dark hair shot through with premature silver at the temples. His face was all harsh angles and aristocratic bone structure, handsome in the way of classical sculpture, cold, perfect, lifeless. Those storm-grey eyes she'd glimpsed earlier, now fixed on her with withering intensity. "You must be the new governess," he said, reaching them. Rain had already soaked his shoulders, but he seemed not to notice. "Get my daughter inside immediately. She'll catch her death." She seemed reluctant to move, Rosalind said, rising to her feet. She stood barely to his shoulder, forced to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "I didn't want to manhandle her on our first meeting. Your sentiment is touching and utterly useless, Catherine." He looked at his daughter, and for just an instant, Rosalind saw something flicker across his features. Pain so profound, it stole her breath. Then it was gone, replaced by that terrible blankness. "Go inside, now." Catherine rose obediently, still clutching her wooden box, and walked toward the house without looking at either adult. She moved like a ghost, silent and insubstantial, leaving wet footprints on the stone path. "Your Grace," Rosalind began, "Lord Thornwick will suffice. I don't stand on ceremony in my own gardens." He turned that devastating gaze on her fully. "Mrs. Pemberton informed you of your duties." She did. "Then you understand that your sole purpose here is Catherine's education and welfare, nothing more. You're not to attempt drawing me into involvement with her daily routine. You're not to seek my guidance on curriculum or discipline. You're not to report to me unless there's an emergency requiring immediate intervention. Is that clear?" Each word was precise, clipped, delivered with the careful enunciation of a man who'd learned to feel nothing at all. Rosalind had encountered many difficult employers in her decade as a governess, but this was something different. This was a man who deliberately murdered his own heart to survive his grief. "Perfectly clear, Lord Thornwick, though I'll note that such distance won't benefit Catherine's recovery." His eyes flashed dangerously. "You presume to lecture me on my daughter's welfare after 5 minutes in my employ? I presume to state the obvious. She's 8 years old. She's lost her mother, and her father has become a stranger. No amount of conjugating French verbs will heal that wound." For a long moment he simply stared at her, rain running down his face like tears he would never shed. Then, slowly, he smiled, but it was the cruelest expression Rosalind had ever seen. All edges and no warmth. "You'll last a week," he said softly. "They all think they can fix us, Miss Harper. All you bright-eyed, determined young women with your theories about childhood development and emotional wellness. But Thornwick Hall breaks everyone eventually. The sadness here is older than grief, deeper than loss. It's in the stones themselves. And when it breaks you, as it broke all the others, you'll leave in the night without a word. They always do." He turned and walked away, leaving Rosalind standing alone by the dry fountain as rain soaked through her traveling dress. That night, in her small room adjoining the schoolroom, Rosalind unpacked her meager belongings and tried to warm herself by an inadequate fire. Through the wall, she could hear Catherine moving about her bedchamber. Small footsteps, the creak of floorboards, then silence. She thought of the Duke's words. "The sadness here is older than grief." She thought of his eyes, those grey eyes that had once surely smiled, that had loved his luminous wife, that had watched life drain from her body. She thought of the child who'd forgotten how to speak, wandering through gardens that matched her internal desolation. Tomorrow she would begin, not with lessons, but with presence, not with demands for speech, but with companionship that expected nothing. She would learn the shape of Catherine's silence, the rhythm of her days, the things that brought even the smallest spark to those winter blue eyes. And as for the Duke of Thornwick, Rosalind had survived scandal, poverty, and loss. She'd learned that the heart could break and still keep beating. Perhaps she couldn't heal him, perhaps no one could. But she could damn well try to reach his daughter before the hall's sadness swallowed the child completely. Through her window, she could see lights burning in the East Wing's tower, the Duke's private chambers, she assumed. A single figure stood at the window, staring out at the rain-swept moors. She was 23rd governess. She wouldn't be the last to flee, but she would be the first to fight. The first week at Thornwick Hall passed in a careful choreography of observation and strategy. Rosalind quickly learned the house's rhythm, or rather, its lack thereof. The estate operated on autopilot, servants performing their duties with mechanical precision, while the master remained secluded and the child drifted through rooms like a wraith. Catherine's routine was rigid. She woke at 7, dressed herself, refusing assistance, took a plain breakfast in the schoolroom at 8, then spent the morning in whatever lessons her governess attempted before retreating to the gardens, regardless of weather. Afternoons found her in her bedchamber with her wooden box and whatever small treasures she'd collected: stones, dead leaves, bird feathers. At precisely 4 o'clock, her father arrived. Rosalind watched this daily ritual with growing dismay. The Duke would enter the schoolroom, stand near the doorway as if reluctant to cross the threshold, and ask, "How does she fare, Miss Harper?" "She's well, my lord. We worked on her letters this morning." "Very good." He would then look at Catherine, who never looked back, and say, "Good afternoon, Catherine. I hope your studies progress satisfactorily." Silence. "Until tomorrow, then." And he would leave, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, while Catherine remained utterly unmoved by his presence, as if he were merely another piece of abandoned furniture. On the 8th day, Rosalind decided to break the pattern. When the Duke arrived for his afternoon visit, she was sitting on the floor with Catherine, a book of fairy tales open between them. She didn't rise or curtsy as propriety demanded. "How does she fare, Miss Harper?" the Duke asked with his usual mechanical precision. "I've no idea, my lord. She won't tell me." Rosalind kept her voice conversational, her attention on the book. "We've been reading The Snow Queen. Odin, I suspect she identifies with Kai, the boy with ice in his heart who can't feel anymore. But that's merely speculation." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I don't recall requesting your psychological assessments." "You didn't. I'm offering them freely, as they're rather central to my actual job, which is helping your daughter, not simply warehousing her in a schoolroom." Catherine's fingers, which had been tracing the book's illustrations, went still. The child's eyes flickered between the two adults, the first sign of genuine interest Rosalind had witnessed. "Your impertinence is noted, Miss Harper. I trust it won't become habitual." "Oh, I imagine it will, my lord. I'm from Hampshire, and we're dreadfully forward in our manners there. Quite shocking, really. We sometimes speak directly about uncomfortable truths, instead of dancing around them for years while everyone suffers in silence." He turned a page in the book. "Catherine, do you think Gerda will find her friend? It seems rather a long journey just for a boy who can't even remember who she is." The Duke stood frozen in the doorway, his expression cycling through shock, fury, and something more complex, something almost alive. "Miss Harper, a word in the corridor, now." Rosalind rose gracefully and followed him out, closing the door behind them. In the dim hallway, he turned on her with barely restrained anger. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I won't tolerate disrespect in my own home." "I'm playing no game, Lord Thornwick. I'm attempting to remind a little girl that adults can have authentic interactions, even difficult ones, that we can experience emotion without the world ending, that it's possible to care about someone and show it, even when it's uncomfortable. You know nothing about my relationship with my daughter. Liam, I know you visit her for 15 minutes daily and speak to her as if she were a particularly fragile piece of porcelain you're terrified of damaging further. I know she watches you leave with no more emotion than she'd give a passing cloud. I know you're both dying inside and refuse to reach for each other across the distance." His hand shot out, gripping her arm, not painfully but desperately, as if he needed to anchor himself to something solid. His face was inches from hers, and she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading his dark hair, the rapid pulse at his throat. "You understand nothing," he said, his voice ragged. "Nothing. When Eleanor died, when I held her body and felt it grow cold, when I realized our child, the son I'd hoped for, had never drawn breath, something essential in me ceased to function. I look at Catherine and see Eleanor's eyes, Eleanor's smile that no longer exists. I reach for her and my hands shake, because what if I break what little remains? What if my touch carries the contagion of my grief? What if she's better off with this distance than with a father who can barely remember how to be human? The raw pain in his voice struck Rosalind like a physical blow. She covered his hand with her own, the impropriety of the gesture irrelevant. "She's not better off," Rosalind said softly. "She's drowning, just as you are. And you're both too afraid to admit you need help staying afloat." He released her abruptly and stepped back, composing his features into that terrible blankness. "You're dismissed for the day. Catherine will take her supper in her room." "As you wish, my lord." But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "The wooden box she carries. Do you know what's in it?" "No, she hasn't shown me." "Her mother's wedding ring, and a lock of Eleanor's hair. She keeps them with her always, these remnants of a woman she can barely remember." He walked away down the darkening corridor, and Rosalind stood alone, her heart aching for the three people who'd once been a family: the luminous Duchess, the silent child, and the broken Duke who haunted his own home like a ghost. The following morning brought unexpected developments. Rosalind arrived at the schoolroom to find Catherine already seated at her desk, the fairy tale book open before her. But rather than waiting passively, the child had taken chalk and slate and written something. Rosalind approached slowly. On the slate, in careful letters, "Did Gerda find him?" A sob caught in Rosalind's throat, quickly suppressed. The first communication in 3 years. Written, yes, but communication nonetheless. "She did," Rosalind said, settling beside her. "Shall we read the rest together and find out how?" Catherine nodded. Once, barely perceptible, but definite. They spent the morning reading the tale's conclusion, how Gerda's tears melted the ice in Kai's heart, how love proved stronger than enchantment, how persistence triumphed over despair. When they finished, Catherine took up her chalk again. "Some hearts cannot melt." Rosalind considered her response carefully. "Perhaps not," she conceded. "But some can thaw, even if slowly. It takes the right warmth, the right patience, the right person willing to sit in the cold until spring comes." Catherine looked at her with those winter blue eyes, and for the first time, Rosalind saw curiosity there, assessment, the beginnings of tentative trust. The afternoon's ritual visitation proceeded as usual, except when the Duke asked his mechanical question. Rosalind said, "Catherine wrote something today, my lord. I thought you might wish to see it." She held out the slate with its careful letters. "Did Gerda find him?" The Duke stared at it for a long moment, his face utterly still. Then slowly his eyes lifted to his daughter. Catherine had turned away, facing the window, her small shoulders rigid with tension. "She found him," the Duke said quietly, his voice thick, "in the Snow Queen's palace, and she saved him with her tears." Catherine's shoulders trembled just slightly. "I'm very pleased you're engaging with your lessons, Catherine," he continued. "Miss Harper is clearly an excellent teacher." He set the slate down gently, nodded to Rosalind, and departed. But at the doorway, he paused and looked back at his daughter's small, rigid figure. "Perhaps tomorrow," he said, so softly Rosalind barely heard. "We might read something together, if you'd permit it." Catherine didn't respond, but she didn't write no either. After he'd gone, Rosalind found Catherine by the window, silent tears streaming down her face, the first she'd shed in Rosalind's presence. "It's all right to cry," Rosalind said gently. "Tears don't make you weak. They make you human." Catherine turned those swimming blue eyes on her and wrote frantically on her slate. "Mama cried when the baby wouldn't come." Then she stopped. Then she was gone. Understanding crashed over Rosalind. "You think crying killed her?" A jerky nod. "Oh, my dear one, no. Her body failed her. Something went terribly wrong that no one could prevent. The crying didn't cause it. Sometimes terrible things happen despite everyone's best efforts. Your mama died, but not because she felt things. She died because sometimes the world is cruel and unfair." Catherine stared at her slate, then slowly, deliberately, she began to cry in earnest, great, heaving sobs that shook her small frame. Rosalind gathered her close, and the child collapsed against her, weeping for the mother she barely remembered, for the father who'd become a stranger, for 3 years of silence and grief. In the corridor outside, hidden in shadow, the Duke of Thornwick stood with his hand pressed against the wall, listening to his daughter finally break, and felt the first crack appear in the ice around his own shattered heart. Winter descended upon Thornwick Hall with Yorkshire's characteristic brutality, fierce winds that rattled window panes, snow that transformed the moors into an endless white expanse, temperatures that made even the heartiest servants huddle near fires. But inside the South Wing's schoolroom, something remarkable was unfolding, the slow, tentative awakening of Lady Catherine Ashford. The child's slate became her voice. She wrote constantly now, questions, observations, sometimes single words that conveyed volumes. "Snow," she'd write, pointing to the window. "Ravens. Hungry." Each word a small miracle that Rosalind celebrated quietly, never pressing for more than Catherine could give. The Duke's 15-minute visits evolved into something resembling actual paternal presence. He began bringing books from the estate's extensive library, volumes of poetry, natural history, illustrated fairy tales. He would sit, somewhat awkwardly, in the schoolroom's wing chair while Rosalind and Catherine worked, ostensibly reading his own correspondence, but clearly listening to their interactions. On December 3rd, precisely 1 month after Rosalind's arrival, he spoke directly to Catherine for the first time, beyond his mechanical greetings. "That's a fine drawing of the raven," he observed, noting her chalk sketch. "You've captured the intelligence in its eye. They're remarkably clever birds." Catherine froze, chalk suspended mid-air. Then slowly she wrote, "Like ravens. Not afraid." "No," the Duke agreed softly. "They're survivors. They endure harsh winters and always find a way through to spring." It wasn't reconciliation, it wasn't healing, but it was conversation, and that was something. One bitter afternoon in mid-December, Mrs. Pemberton appeared at the schoolroom door with an expression of suppressed excitement that sat oddly on her usually severe features. "Miss Harper, there's a visitor for you in the morning room, a Lady Beatrice Thornton Hale." Rosalind's heart leapt. "Aunt Beatrice is here?" "You know this person?" the Duke asked sharply. He'd been reviewing Catherine's arithmetic slate and looked up with sudden intensity. "She's my mother's older sister, my lord. I haven't seen her in 5 years. She's been travelling on the continent. I had no idea she even knew where I was." Rosalind turned to Catherine. "May I be excused for a short while?" Catherine nodded and wrote, "Family important." "Indeed it is. I'll return shortly." Udidi. The morning room was one of the few chambers in Thornwick Hall maintained in proper order, doubtless because it was occasionally used for estate business. Lady Beatrice stood by the window, a striking figure of 60-some years, with silver hair swept into an elegant arrangement and shrewd grey eyes that missed nothing. She wore travelling clothes of deep burgundy wool, expertly tailored, and radiated the confidence of a woman who'd spent decades navigating society on her own terms. "Rosalind, my dear girl," she embraced her niece warmly, "you look positively frozen. Don't they heat this mausoleum properly? Aunt Beatrice, what on earth are you doing in Yorkshire? I returned to London 3 weeks ago to discover you'd vanished like smoke. Your former employer, that dreadful Lady Ashworth, took tremendous satisfaction in telling anyone who'd listen that you'd fled in disgrace after making advances toward her husband. Utter nonsense, of course. George Ashworth has been propositioning governesses for 20 years. I knew you'd never touch that pompous peacock." Rosalind felt her face heat. "You knew about the scandal?" "Darling, I made it my business to know. I also made it my business to visit Lady Ashworth and explain in excruciating detail exactly how I would ensure her husband's proclivities became common knowledge if she didn't retract her vicious lies. She published a correction in the Times this week, quite buried, but sufficient to restore your reputation among anyone who matters." "Aunt Beatrice!" Rosalind didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "That was incredibly reckless. I'm 64 years old, with a substantial fortune, no husband to answer to, and precisely 0 patience for bullies. Besides, your mother wrote me in Bath, frantic with worry. I tracked you to this Gothic pile through a series of inquiries that would make Bow Street's finest investigators weep with envy. Now, tell me, the Duke of Thornwick, what's he like?" "Broken," Rosalind said simply. grief-stricken, shut off from his daughter and everyone else, but she paused, considering. Perhaps not irredeemably so. There are moments when I see glimpses of who he must have been before tragedy struck, and the child, beginning to emerge from her own darkness, slowly. She communicates through writing now, small words, but it's progress. Lady Beatrice studied her niece with those penetrating eyes. You care for them, both of them. I care about helping a traumatized child, yes, and her father. Aunt Beatrice, don't dissemble with me, Rosalind Harper. I've known you since you were in leading strings. You've always had a dangerous tendency toward empathy, particularly for wounded creatures. And men don't come more wounded than a widowed duke haunting his own estate. Before Rosalind could formulate a response, the morning room door opened and the Duke himself entered, his expression wary. Forgive the intrusion. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned Miss Harper had a visitor. I wanted to ensure. He trailed off, taking in Lady Beatrice's commanding presence. That I'm not some disreputable connection here to drag your governess back into scandal. Lady Beatrice finished coolly. She executed a perfect curtsy, managing to make it seem somehow ironic. Lady Beatrice Thornton Hale, Your Grace. Rosalind's maternal aunt and self-appointed guardian since her parents' declining health has left them rather ineffective at protecting her interests. The Duke's eyebrows rose. Thornton Hale, you're Lord Pembroke's widow. I am. And before you attempt to have me removed for corrupting your household, I should mention that I'm also a long-standing friend of your late mother, the Dowager Duchess Frances. We were presented at court together in 1838, a lifetime ago. She mentioned you in her letters, her brilliant, sensitive son who loved books and horses in equal measure. Something flickered across the Duke's face. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of remembered affection. My mother passed 4 years ago. I know. I was in Venice when I received word. I grieved her loss considerably. Lady Beatrice's voice softened. She would be devastated to see what's become of Thornwick Hall. She loved this place with fierce devotion. Then she's fortunate to have been spared its current state. Is she? Or would she have fought to restore it, to pull her son and granddaughter back from the brink of complete isolation? Lady Beatrice's directness would have been shocking in most contexts, but somehow her authority made it permissible. Your Grace, I don't know you, but I know grief. I lost my husband to cholera 30 years ago, and I lost myself for a time in that darkness. What brought me back was someone, a very impertinent friend, who refused to allow me to surrender entirely to sorrow, who insisted I still had purpose, still had life to live. The Duke's jaw tightened. With respect, Lady Beatrice, my circumstances are not unique, merely more tragic than most, she interrupted. And you have a child who needs her father back before she forgets what it means to be truly loved. For a long moment, the Duke simply stared at this formidable woman who'd invaded his home and casually demolished his defenses. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, rusty sound, as if his vocal cords had forgotten how to produce it. You're as terrifying as my mother described. She called you Beatrice the Undefeated in her letters. I prefer Beatrice the Insufferable, but I'll accept any epithet that suggests competence. She glanced between the Duke and Rosalind. Now, Your Grace, I understand you maintain a library of some distinction. Might I impose upon you for a tour? I'm particularly interested in regional history, and I believe your family's collection includes several rare manuscripts documenting Yorkshire during the Tudor period. The Duke looked bemused by this rapid shift in conversation. Yes, the library is this way. As they moved toward the door, Lady Beatrice threw Rosalind a speaking glance that clearly communicated, "We will discuss this situation in detail later." That evening, after Lady Beatrice had departed for the inn in the nearby village with promises to return the following day, the Duke appeared at the schoolroom door during Catherine's supper, well outside his usual visiting hours. "Miss Harper, might I speak with you?" Rosalind followed him into the corridor, noting the unusual tension in his posture. "Your aunt is a force of nature." She is indeed, my lord. I apologize if her directness caused offence. On the contrary. He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. She reminded me of my mother, of a time when this house was filled with people who spoke honestly, who challenged me, who refused to treat me like fragile porcelain. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Your Grace! Nathaniel, he said abruptly. When we're speaking privately, you may call me Nathaniel. This, your Grace and my lord, creates a distance that's no longer necessary. Rosalind's pulse quickened. That would be highly irregular. Miss Harper, Rosalind, nothing about this situation is regular. You've accomplished in 5 weeks what 22 governesses before you couldn't achieve in 3 years, Catherine writes. She engages with lessons. She cried for God's sake, which I'd thought impossible, and He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it. I find myself actually wanting to be present for those 15-minute visits, wanting to extend them, wanting to know my daughter again. That's wonderful, Rosalind said softly. It's terrifying, because caring again means risking loss again. It means acknowledging how much time I've wasted in this half-death. It means facing what I've done to Catherine through my absence. His storm-grey eyes met hers, and she saw such naked vulnerability there that her breath caught. How does one begin to repair such comprehensive damage? One day at a time. One small gesture at a time, one moment of genuine connection at a time. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to offer comfort, but propriety held her frozen. You've already started, Nathaniel, by wanting to try. He stared at her for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of the strange intimacy developing in this cold, sad house. Thank you, he said finally, for not giving up on us. After he'd gone, Rosalind leaned against the wall, her heart racing. This was dangerous territory. Caring too much for her employer, seeing him not as the distant duke, but as Nathaniel, the wounded man trying desperately to find his way back to humanity. But it was too late for caution. She was already falling, had been falling since that first moment in the rain-soaked garden when she'd seen the devastation in his eyes. And somewhere in Thornwick Hall's cold stone walls, spring was beginning to stir. The Christmas season approached with Thornwick Hall wrapped in snow and silence, but this year, something was different. Lady Beatrice had extended her stay, taking rooms at the estate rather than the village inn, and her presence brought unexpected vitality to the mouldering grandeur. She bullied the staff into cleaning long-neglected chambers, ordered evergreen boughs and holly from the village, and insisted on proper fires in every inhabited room. "This house needs life," she declared over breakfast one morning in the newly opened dining room, the first time in 5 years that it had been used for its intended purpose. Nathaniel, Rosalind, Catherine, and Lady Beatrice sat together, an unconventional gathering that would have scandalized society, but felt perfectly natural within Thornwick's walls. It needs laughter and light, and people actually living in it, rather than simply existing. Catherine, emboldened by Beatrice's commanding warmth, wrote on her slate, "Christmas." "Indeed, Your Grace, surely you haven't planned to ignore the holiday entirely." Nathaniel set down his coffee with deliberate care. "We haven't celebrated Christmas since Eleanor died. All the more reason to revive the tradition. Catherine is 8 years old. She deserves Christmas pudding and carols, and at least a small tree in the drawing room." Beatrice's tone brooked no argument. "I'll manage the arrangements if you're too overwhelmed by sentiment." "Aunt Beatrice," Rosalind said warningly, recognizing the signs of her aunt overstepping. But Nathaniel surprised them both. A small celebration would be acceptable. Nothing elaborate, just the 4 of us, perhaps. If Catherine would like it. All eyes turned to the child, who looked between the adults with something approaching wonder. Then she wrote, her hand shaking slightly, "Please." "Then it's settled," Lady Beatrice declared triumphantly. "Rosalind and I will handle decorations. Your Grace can source an appropriate tree from the estate. Catherine, you'll help us make garlands. We have 1 week to transform this mausoleum into something resembling festive." The following days brought unexpected joy to Thornwick Hall. Nathaniel personally selected a fir tree from the estate's woods and supervised its installation in the drawing room, a chamber that had been shrouded in holland covers for years. Servants emerged from their mechanical routine to polish silver, clean windows, prepare traditional foods. Catherine discovered she had a talent for arranging holly and ivy, creating centerpieces with focused intensity. And Rosalind watched Nathaniel slowly, tentatively, return to the world of the living. He smiled one afternoon when Catherine's garland-making resulted in more pine needles in her hair than on the rope. He laughed, actually laughed, when Lady Beatrice's attempt at stringing popcorn ended with the bowl overturning and kernels scattering across the carpet. He stood close to Rosalind while they decorated the tree, his shoulder brushing hers, his voice low and warm as he shared memories of Christmases past. Eleanor loved this holiday, he said, holding an ornament, a delicate glass angel. She would spend weeks planning elaborate celebrations. Music, dancing, half the county invited for festivities. The house was alive then. "She sounds wonderful," Rosalind said gently. She was luminous, like sunlight made flesh. "I was 30 when we married, old enough to have been quite set in my bachelor ways. She transformed everything simply by existing." He hung the angel carefully on the highest branch. "For the longest time I thought keeping everything frozen as it was when she died was the only way to honor her memory. But that's not honor, is it? It's cowardice." "It's survival," Rosalind corrected. "You did what you needed to do to keep breathing. But now you're ready for more than mere survival." His eyes met hers, intense and searching. "Am I? Or am I simply following where you and your terrifying aunt lead because I've forgotten how to chart my own course? Does the reason matter if the destination is healing? Perhaps not." He reached past her to hang another ornament, and his hand brushed hers, a touch so brief it could have been accidental, except for the way his fingers lingered just a fraction too long. "Rosalind, I need to ask you something, and I need your honest answer. What will you do when Catherine no longer needs a governess? When she's talking again, when she's well enough for traditional education, perhaps at a school in York or Bath?" The question struck like a physical blow. Rosalind had carefully avoided thinking about the future, about the inevitable day when her purpose at Thornwick would end. "I suppose I'll seek another position," she said, keeping her voice steady. "That's what governesses do." "What if I asked you to stay regardless?" Her pulse thundered in her ears. "In what capacity?" "I don't know." Frustration edged his voice. "As Catherine's companion, as estate manager. God knows this place needs comprehensive attention. As—" He stopped, seeming to catch himself. "I'm being inappropriate." "Yes," Rosalind agreed, her throat tight. "You are. Forgive me. I have no right to complicate your life further. You've already sacrificed enough for our benefit." He turned to leave, but Rosalind caught his sleeve, a gesture of shocking familiarity that froze them both. "I don't know what you were about to say," she said quietly, "but I need you to understand something. I came to Thornwick expecting nothing more than employment. I had no illusions about healing anyone or forming lasting connections, but your daughter has become precious to me. This house, for all its sadness, has become something like home. And you—" She released his sleeve, propriety reasserting itself. "You've become more than my employer. I don't have the words for what that means, but I need you to know it's true." For a long moment, they stood in the drawing room with its half-decorated tree, the air between them charged with everything unspoken. Then Nathaniel raised his hand and very gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "If circumstances were different," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, "if I were anyone other than a duke with responsibilities and expectations, if you were anything other than my daughter's governess, if the world weren't constantly watching, judging, constraining. But circumstances are what they are," Rosalind finished, though her heart was breaking. "And we must honor them. Must we?" The question hung between them, dangerous and tempting. Before either could answer, Catherine appeared in the doorway with Lady Beatrice, the child holding a star for the tree's top. The moment shattered, returning them to their proper roles. Employer and employee, duke and governess, nothing more. But everything had changed nonetheless. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snowfall that transformed Thornwick's grounds into a winter wonderland. Lady Beatrice had somehow procured musicians from York, a small ensemble that filled the drawing room with carols and traditional melodies. The servants joined them for dinner, a democratic gesture that would have been unthinkable in most aristocratic houses, but felt perfectly right within Thornwick's walls. Catherine wore a new dress, deep green velvet that complemented her blonde hair, and actually smiled when Nathaniel presented her with a beautifully wrapped gift. Inside was a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed in gold. "For your thoughts," he said, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. "Since you prefer writing to speaking, you can fill these pages with anything you wish, observations, drawings, stories, secrets. They're yours alone unless you choose to share them." Catherine stared at the journal, then at her father, then threw her arms around his neck in a fierce embrace that clearly shocked them both. Nathaniel froze for a heartbeat before his arms came up to hold her, his eyes closing against sudden tears. "I love you, Catherine," he whispered. "I never stopped. I just forgot how to show it. Forgive me." She couldn't answer in words, but her tightening embrace said everything necessary. Rosalind turned away to hide her own tears, only to find Lady Beatrice beside her, pressing a handkerchief into her hand. "Well done, my dear," her aunt murmured. "You've given them back to each other. They found their own way back. I just stayed present. Don't diminish your role. Staying present when darkness surrounds you is its own form of courage." Lady Beatrice paused, then added carefully, "And what of your own heart? Have you considered what staying here might cost you?" "I don't understand." "Don't you? Rosalind, I've watched you with him. I've seen how your face changes when he enters a room, how you listen when he speaks as if his words contain profound truth. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, like a drowning man who's just glimpsed shore. This situation cannot end well if feelings have developed beyond professional regard. I'm his employee. Nothing more can come of it. You're a woman of intelligence and character who's helped him reclaim his humanity. That's far more significant than mere employment. But the world won't care. Society will savage you both if there's even a whisper of impropriety. And the child, Catherine would be caught in the middle of any scandal. Rosalind knew her aunt was right. The fragile healing they'd achieved could be destroyed by gossip, by judgment, by the rigid constraints of social propriety. A duke did not marry his daughter's governess. Such things simply didn't happen, not in their world. "Then I'll ensure there's no impropriety to gossip about," Rosalind said firmly. "I'll maintain proper distance. I'll do my job and nothing more." "Can you, now that feelings exist?" It was the question Rosalind couldn't answer. The evening ended with everyone gathered around the piano, Lady Beatrice playing, Nathaniel's surprising baritone joining Rosalind's clear soprano in traditional carols. Catherine sat between them, her journal open on her lap, and she mouthed the words she couldn't yet voice aloud. When the clock struck midnight, signaling Christmas Day, Nathaniel raised a glass of wine. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes finding Rosalind's, "to healing, to family, however unconventional, to hope." They drank, and in that moment, Thornwick Hall felt truly alive for the first time in 5 years. But beneath the joy, beneath the healing, danger lurked, because healing had made them vulnerable. Happiness had given them something to lose, and the world beyond Thornwick's walls was not kind to those who defied its rigid expectations. 2 days after Christmas, a carriage arrived bearing an unexpected visitor, Lord Stirling Blackwood, the Duke's second cousin and heir presumptive to the Thornwick title. He was a handsome man of 32 with cold blue eyes and an entitled air that immediately put Rosalind on guard. "Nathaniel!" He embraced his cousin with performative warmth. I heard through the family network that you'd finally emerged from mourning. Thought I'd come see the transformation for myself. Sterling. This is unexpected. Nathaniel's welcome was notably less enthusiastic. Is it? I am family after all, and I've been concerned about young Catherine's welfare. The rumours about her condition, the muteness, the string of failed governesses, one worries. His gaze landed on Rosalind with calculating assessment, and she knew immediately that Lord Blackwood's visit was no friendly social call. This was someone with his own agenda, someone threatened by Thornwick's healing, someone who would prove very dangerous indeed. Lord Sterling Blackwood settled into Thornwick Hall with the presumptuous ease of someone who expected to own it someday. He was perfectly polite, impeccably mannered, and utterly insufferable in ways that made Rosalind's instincts scream warnings. "A governess from Hampshire," he said the first evening at dinner, his tone carrying just enough condescension to be insulting without being overtly rude. "How quaint. And you've worked miracles with our dear Catherine, I understand. Quite remarkable for someone with your limited experience." "Miss Harper's background is more than adequate for Catherine's needs," Nathaniel said coolly from the head of the table. "Her success speaks for itself." "Oh, undoubtedly. I meant no criticism." Sterling smiled, all teeth and no warmth, though one does wonder about the wisdom of such an intimate arrangement. A young, unmarried woman living in close quarters with a widowed duke and his impressionable daughter. People do talk, Nathaniel. Lady Beatrice, seated across from Sterling, set down her wineglass with deliberate precision. People who have nothing productive to occupy their time often resort to gossip. It's a symptom of intellectual poverty. Sterling's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Lady Beatrice, your reputation for bluntness precedes you. How long will you be gracing Thornwick with your presence?" "As long as I'm needed, to ensure Rosalind and Catherine aren't harassed by officious relatives who've shown precious little interest in family welfare until the possibility of scandal presents itself." The tension at the table could have been cut with a knife. Catherine, seated beside Rosalind, gripped her slate tightly, but wrote nothing. Nathaniel's jaw was clenched so hard Rosalind feared he'd crack teeth. "I assure you, my concern is entirely for the family's reputation," Sterling said smoothly. "Nathaniel, you know how society operates. The vultures have been circling since Eleanor's death, waiting for any hint of impropriety. A beautiful governess living under your roof, no proper chaperone." "Lady Beatrice serves as chaperone," Nathaniel interrupted. "An aunt to the governess? That's hardly sufficient by society's standards. No, I think what's needed here is a more permanent solution to the situation. Catherine needs a proper mother figure, not a paid employee. You need a wife, Nathaniel, someone of appropriate station who can restore Thornwick Hall to its former glory and silence the gossips." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Sterling was suggesting, no, pushing for Nathaniel to remarry, and from the calculating look in his eyes, he already had a candidate in mind. "My marital status is my own concern," Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. Of course. But consider, my sister Victoria returned from her finishing school in Switzerland last month. She's 23, impeccably bred, trained in all the domestic arts. Your mother, God rest her soul, always hoped you two might make a match. Before Eleanor, that is. Victoria was 15 when I married Eleanor. And now she's a woman grown. Beautiful, accomplished, and most importantly, appropriate. She could be everything Thornwick needs, everything Catherine needs. Rosalind felt something sharp twist in her chest. The world Sterling described, where Nathaniel remarried some perfect aristocratic bride, where Catherine acquired a proper mother, where Rosalind became redundant and was dismissed, was entirely logical. It was how their society functioned. Dukes married ladies, governesses moved on to new positions, and personal feelings were irrelevant, but logic didn't make it hurt less. Catherine suddenly scraped her chair back and fled the dining room, her slate clattering to the floor. Rosalind immediately rose to follow, but Nathaniel stopped her with a gesture. "I'll go," he said quietly. "Sterling, we'll continue this conversation later. Lady Beatrice, Perhaps you could show our guest to the library." He left, and Rosalind found herself alone with Sterling and her aunt. Sterling's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing cold calculation beneath. "You seem uncomfortable, Miss Harper. Surely you don't imagine your position here is permanent?" "I imagine it will last as long as Catherine needs me and the Duke wishes to employ me. Beyond that, I make no assumptions." "Very wise. Because, make no mistake, this little domestic fantasy you've constructed here cannot endure. Nathaniel may be grateful for your service. He may even fancy himself half in love with you. But he's a duke, with responsibilities to his lineage. You're a governess from Hampshire, with a scandal in your recent past. The mathematics are quite simple." "Sterling," Lady Beatrice's voice cracked like a whip. "That's quite enough. I'm merely stating reality. Miss Harper strikes me as a practical woman. Better she understands her situation clearly than harbors false hopes that can only lead to heartbreak." He stood, smoothing his waistcoat. "Now, shall we adjourn to that library? I'm suddenly quite interested in reviewing the family's genealogical records. Inheritance law is such a fascinating subject." After he'd departed with Lady Beatrice, who threw Rosalind a sympathetic look over her shoulder, Rosalind stood alone in the dining room, Sterling's words echoing in her mind. He was right, of course. Everything he'd said was absolutely true. She was a fool to imagine anything beyond her current position. Nathaniel might care for her, might even feel something deeper than gratitude, but caring wasn't enough to bridge the vast social chasm between them. She found Nathaniel in Catherine's bedchamber, sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed, while the child clung to him and sobbed silently against his chest. His hand stroked her hair with infinite gentleness. "She wrote that she doesn't want a new mama," he said quietly as Rosalind entered, "that she likes things as they are, that change is frightening." "Change is always frightening," Rosalind said, settling in the chair beside the bed, "especially when you've only just begun to feel safe again. Sterling means well in his own misguided way. He's right that society expects certain things from me, but Catherine's needs come first, always. And if she's not ready for me to remarry, if she needs things to remain stable while she continues healing, then that's what will happen. Sterling and his schemes be damned." Catherine pulled back enough to look at her father, her tear-stained face filled with desperate hope. She pointed to Rosalind, then to herself, then to Nathaniel. The message was clear, the three of them together. This configuration, this fragile family unit they'd constructed. "I know, sweetheart," Nathaniel whispered. "I know. We'll find a way." But as Rosalind watched them, she wondered if he was making promises he couldn't keep. Because Sterling had illuminated the fundamental problem. Their happiness existed in isolation, in the bubble of Thornwick Hall. But they couldn't remain isolated forever. Eventually, society would intrude. Eventually, choices would have to be made. And when they were, Rosalind knew who would be sacrificed to propriety. The following week brought a succession of visitors Sterling had clearly arranged. Lady Victoria Blackwood, his sister, arrived with their mother. Victoria was exactly as Sterling had described, blonde, beautiful, accomplished, and utterly perfect. She played piano beautifully, discussed estate management with intelligence, and treated Catherine with appropriate kindness that had nothing genuine behind it. "You're doing wonderful work with Lady Catherine," Victoria told Rosalind one afternoon, her tone dripping with aristocratic condescension. "It must be so rewarding, knowing you've helped this poor child. I'm sure when the Duke and I marry, we'll provide you with excellent references for your next position." "When you marry," Rosalind kept her voice carefully neutral. "Well, Sterling and Mama are quite set on it, and Nathaniel needs a proper wife to restore his standing in society. I'll be good for him, good for Catherine. You understand, I'm sure. It's simply how things are done in families like ours." It was a masterclass in aristocratic dismissal, polite, perfectly proper, and devastating in its casual cruelty. That evening, Rosalind found Nathaniel in the library, staring into the fire with a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked exhausted, trapped, utterly miserable. "They're leaving tomorrow, thank God," he said without preamble. "Sterling, Victoria, The lot of them. I've made it clear I have no intention of courting Victoria, no matter how perfect she supposedly is. She is quite lovely, Rosalind said carefully. She's a porcelain doll who'd make Catherine miserable and drive me to distraction within a month. She has all the depth of a puddle and about as much warmth. He set down his glass and turned to face her. Rosalind, we need to discuss what happens next. What we do about this impossible situation we've found ourselves in. There's nothing to discuss, Nathaniel. You're a duke. I'm a governess. Your cousin is right about the mathematics. Damn the mathematics. Damn propriety and society's expectations and all the ridiculous rules that prevent people from simply being happy. I care for you deeply, in ways I thought impossible after Eleanor died. And I can see that you feel similarly. So why should we surrender to convention? Because scandal would destroy Catherine, Rosalind thought. Because society would savage them both. Because loving him wasn't enough when the world would never accept them. Because some things matter more than individual happiness, she said aloud. Catherine's welfare, your family's reputation, the stability we've only just achieved. I won't be the reason that crumbles. You're the reason it exists at all. Then let that be enough. Let me continue as Catherine's governess. Let us maintain proper distance. Let you eventually find someone appropriate to marry, someone who can be everything Thornwick needs without causing scandal or harm. I don't want someone appropriate. I want you. The words hung between them, raw and honest and impossible. Rosalind felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Sometimes we don't get what we want, she whispered. Sometimes we have to accept what's possible and be grateful for it. I refuse to accept that. Then you're a fool. And I'm an even greater fool for loving you despite knowing it's hopeless. She hadn't meant to say it. The confession escaped before she could stop it. Nathaniel stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, joy, and despair. Rosalind, don't. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Just let me continue doing my job. Let me help Catherine grow strong enough that she doesn't need me anymore. And when that day comes, I'll leave quietly, and you'll move forward with your appropriate life, and we'll both survive this. Survive? Is that really all you want? Mere survival? Sometimes survival is the greatest victory we can achieve. She left him standing in the library, knowing she'd done the right thing and hating herself for it nonetheless. But in the doorway, she paused and looked back at him one last time. He stood silhouetted against the firelight, a figure of such profound loneliness that her heart cracked clean through. For what it's worth, she said softly, if circumstances were different, if we were different people in a different world, I would have loved spending my life making you happy. We could still... No, we couldn't. Goodbye, Nathaniel. This time, she didn't stop walking until she reached her room, where she finally allowed herself to cry for the future they could never have. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing Thornwick Hall in cold white silence. February arrived with the first hints of thaw, ice melting from eaves, snowdrops pushing through frozen ground, days growing imperceptibly longer. And within Thornwick Hall, other transformations continued their slow, inevitable progress. Catherine spoke her first word on Valentine's Day. They were in the schoolroom working on a history lesson when the child suddenly looked up from her slate and said very clearly, "Father." Rosalind froze, her chalk suspended mid-air. "Catherine, did you—" "Father," she repeated, louder this time as if testing the sound. Then, turning those blue eyes on Rosalind, "Miss Harper." Tears streamed down Rosalind's face as she pulled the child into a fierce embrace. "Yes, yes, my darling girl, you can speak. You found your voice." The Duke, Nathaniel, arrived moments later, summoned by Rosalind's message. When Catherine looked at him and said, "Papa," in her small, uncertain voice, he collapsed to his knees before her and wept openly, holding his daughter as if she were infinitely precious and impossibly fragile. "My brave girl," he whispered against her hair. "My brave, strong, wonderful girl. I'm so proud of you." "Missed you," Catherine said haltingly. "When you were sad, missed you. I'm here now. I promise I'm here now. It was the beginning of rapid progress. Within weeks, Catherine was speaking in full sentences, engaging in conversations, actually laughing at jokes and silly stories. Her personality emerged like spring flowers after a long winter, curious, intelligent, occasionally stubborn, deeply loving. She was Eleanor's daughter in appearance, but her temperament was entirely her own. Lady Beatrice remained at Thornwick through March, ostensibly to ensure Catherine's continued progress, but actually, as she admitted privately to Rosalind, to serve as chaperone and buffer between Rosalind and Nathaniel. "You're both being admirably restrained," she observed one afternoon, as they walked the gradually reviving gardens. "Painfully so. Anyone with eyes can see you're desperately in love with each other, yet you maintain this elaborate charade of professional distance. It's either remarkably noble or remarkably stupid. I haven't decided which." "It's necessary," Rosalind said firmly. "Catherine is thriving. The estate is healing. Nathaniel has begun engaging with his responsibilities again, attending sessions in the House of Lords, managing Thornwick's business affairs, even accepting some social invitations. Everything is moving in the right direction. A scandal would destroy that progress. Or perhaps honesty would liberate everyone involved. This is the real world, Aunt Beatrice. Honesty is a luxury people in our position cannot afford." But maintaining distance grew increasingly difficult as spring progressed. Nathaniel found excuses to spend time in the schoolroom, reviewing Catherine's progress, bringing books he thought might interest her, lingering over tea while discussing curricula. His hand would brush Rosalind's when passing documents. His eyes would linger on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. The air between them hummed with everything unspoken. In April, Lord Stirling Blackwood returned with disturbing news. "Nathaniel, we need to discuss the estate's finances," he said without preamble, spreading documents across the library desk. "I've been reviewing the accounts as your heir presumptive, as is my right and responsibility, and the situation is far worse than I imagined. Years of neglect have resulted in significant losses. Tenant farms producing below capacity, necessary repairs ignored, investments left unmanaged. Thornwick is hemorrhaging money." Nathaniel studied the figures with growing dismay. "How bad is it?" "Without substantial capital injection or significant reduction in expenses, you'll be bankrupt within 3 years. The entail protects the land itself, but everything else, the contents of the house, the art collection, your mother's jewellery, will have to be sold. Catherine's dowry, already modest, will be non-existent. What do you suggest?" Stirling's smile was all calculation. Marriage to Victoria would solve everything. Her dowry is substantial, £50,000. Her father's connections could secure favourable terms on loans to modernise the estate's operations. The alliance would restore Thornwick's social standing and ensure Catherine's future security. It's the obvious solution. "I'm not marrying for money, Stirling. And you're condemning your daughter to poverty. Is that really your choice? Pride over Catherine's welfare?" Rosalind, who'd been working with Catherine in the adjacent schoolroom, heard every word through the partially open door. Her heart sank as she recognized the trap closing around them. Stirling was right. Financially, marriage to Victoria made perfect sense. And Nathaniel's first responsibility was to Catherine's future, not to his own happiness or Rosalind's heart. That evening, she found Nathaniel standing at the newly repaired fountain in the garden, the place where they'd first met 6 months ago. Spring had transformed it, water flowing again, flowers blooming around its base, the whole garden slowly returning to life. "You heard Stirling's report," he said without turning. It wasn't a question. "Yes. He's not wrong about the finances. I was so lost in grief, I neglected everything. And now, Catherine will pay the price for my failures. Or you'll make a pragmatic decision that secures her future," Rosalind said, though each word felt like swallowing glass. "Victoria is young, beautiful, wealthy. She can give Catherine stability and you the means to restore Thornwick properly. It's the logical choice." "I don't want logic, I want—" He turned to face her, his expression raw with frustration. Damn it, Rosalind. I want to wake up every morning with you beside me. I want to raise Catherine together as a true family. I want to spend my evenings in conversation with someone who challenges me and understands me and makes me laugh. I want to love and be loved by someone who sees me, Nathaniel, not the Duke, not the title, not the estate and obligations, just me. I know, she whispered. I want that too, but wanting isn't enough. What if I found a way? What if I could secure Thornwick's finances without marrying Victoria? Could we— Don't, she interrupted. Don't offer me hope that can't be fulfilled. It's cruel. Is it crueler than this agony of proximity without connection? Rosalind, I love you. I'm in love with you. And I believe you love me equally. How can we simply surrender to circumstance? Before she could respond, a small voice interrupted. Miss Harper, Papa? They turned to find Catherine standing on the garden path, her expression troubled. How much had she heard? Are you fighting? The child asked quietly. Are you leaving, Miss Harper? No, sweetheart. We're just discussing complicated adult matters. Matters about money and marriage. Catherine's intelligence had always been evident, but her directness still surprised Rosalind. I heard Uncle Sterling. He wants Papa to marry that awful Victoria lady, so we'll have money. Catherine, Nathaniel began, I don't want a new mother. I don't want anything to change. We're happy now, the three of us. Can't we just stay like this? Rosalind knelt before the child, taking her small hands. Life requires changes sometimes, darling. Your father has responsibilities to the estate, to you, to his position in society. Those things matter, even when they're difficult. But you matter too. You brought Papa back. You made him smile again. You made me brave enough to speak. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. Please don't leave. Please. The child threw her arms around Rosalind's neck, clinging desperately, and Rosalind felt her own resolve crumbling. She looked over Catherine's head to meet Nathaniel's gaze and saw her own despair reflected there. How could they sacrifice this fragile family they'd built? But how could they not, when Catherine's financial security hung in the balance? The answer came from an unexpected source 3 days later, when Lady Beatrice requested a private meeting with Nathaniel in the library. Your Grace, I have a proposal, a business proposal to be precise. He settled into a chair with regal dignity. I'm a widow of substantial means, with no children and distant relations I actively dislike. My fortune, approximately £120,000, plus property in Bath and London, currently sits in various investments generating modest returns. I propose lending you £50,000 at favourable terms to modernise Thornwick's operations and resolve immediate financial pressures. Nathaniel stared at her. Lady Beatrice, I couldn't possibly— You can and you will. The terms are these. 3% annual interest, repayment schedule of 20 years, with the loan secured against Thornwick's unentailed properties. Additionally, I'll transfer my Bath property into trust for Catherine as her dowry, ensuring she has independence regardless of future circumstances. In exchange, I ask only 2 things. First, that I be permitted to live here at Thornwick for the remainder of my life. I've grown fond of this mouldering pile, and Yorkshire suits my temperament. Second, that you stop being a coward and marry my niece before I die of frustration, watching you pine for each other like characters in a bad novel. Lily. The silence in the library was absolute. That's Lady Beatrice. The impropriety— Nathaniel seemed utterly incapable of forming coherent sentences. Oh, spare me the propriety lectures. You're a widower of 6 years. She's a gentlewoman of good family who's performed miracles for your household. Yes, she was employed as a governess, but she's also my niece and thus a connection to the Thornton Hale family, which traces its lineage to the Plantagenets. Marry her quietly, endure a year or 2 of gossip, and let your obvious happiness together eventually silence the vultures. Catherine adores her. You love her. She loves you. The mathematics, as your odious cousin likes to say, are actually quite simple if you remove artificial constraints. The scandal will pale in comparison to the scandal of bankrupting a ducal estate through neglect. Society adores a romantic redemption story, the grieving duke who rediscovered life through love. They'll dine out on that tale for years. Trust me, I've navigated society's treacherous waters for decades. I know which battles can be won. Nathaniel sat slowly, his mind clearly racing. You'd do this, risk your fortune on Thornwick. I'd invest in people I've come to care for, yes. And unlike your cousin's scheme, my proposal allows everyone involved to actually be happy. Radical concept, I know. Rosalind would never agree. She's too concerned about Catherine's welfare, about scandal affecting my daughter. Then you'll have to convince her, court her properly, make her understand that sometimes the reckless choice is actually the right one. Lady Beatrice stood, smoothing her skirts. Now, I suggest you begin by dismissing Sterling and his machinations. Tell him you've secured alternative financing and his services as financial advisor are no longer required. Then we can focus on the far more pleasant matter of planning a wedding. When Nathaniel told Rosalind of Lady Beatrice's proposal that evening, she immediately protested. Your aunt's generosity is overwhelming, but Nathaniel, I can't let her risk her fortune. It's her choice to make, not yours, just as my choice to marry you is mine, not society's. He took her hands, his grey eyes intense. Rosalind, I've spent 6 years half alive, drowning in grief. You gave me back myself. You gave me back my daughter. You transformed this house from a mausoleum into a home. How can I not fight for a future with you? The gossip will eventually fade. Let them talk. Let them judge. Catherine will be financially secure regardless, thanks to your aunt. The estate will recover. And we will build a life together based on love and mutual respect and genuine partnership. Isn't that worth fighting for? Rosalind looked at this man she'd come to love. No longer the broken duke, but Nathaniel, complicated and wounded and trying desperately to do right by everyone. She thought of Catherine, who'd become the daughter of her heart. She thought of Thornwick Hall, transformed from cold stone into warm sanctuary, and she thought, perhaps some risks are worth taking, perhaps some happiness is worth fighting for. Yes, she whispered, yes, it's worth fighting for. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were infinitely precious, and Rosalind felt the last of her resistance crumble into joy. They married in May in Thornwick's chapel, a small ceremony attended only by Catherine, Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Pemberton, and a handful of staff who'd witnessed the household's transformation. Catherine served as flower girl, radiant in primrose silk, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, she cheered so loudly it echoed off the ancient stone walls. Society did talk, as predicted. For 6 months, the scandal titillated drawing rooms from London to Edinburgh. The Duke who'd married his daughter's governess, the presumption, the impropriety. But gradually, as the newlyweds appeared together at county functions and London's season events, clearly devoted to each other and thriving, the gossip lost its vicious edge. And eventually, it transformed into something almost approving. The tragic widower who'd found love again, the governess who'd healed a broken family, the romance that had conquered grief. 1 year after her arrival at Thornwick, Rosalind stood in the gardens she'd first seen barren and neglected. Now roses bloomed along restored pergolas, fountains sparkled in summer sun, and formal hedges had been expertly trimmed. The estate hummed with renewed purpose, tenant farms thriving, necessary repairs completed, the house itself alive with music and laughter. Nathaniel emerged from the house with Catherine, the girl chattering excitedly about her upcoming birthday celebration. At 9, she was confident, verbal, happy, a completely different child from the silent wraith Rosalind had first encountered. "Mama!" Catherine called, racing across the lawn. She'd started using the title 3 months after the wedding, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. "Papa says I can invite friends from the village for my party. Can we have it in the garden?" Rosalind smiled, gathering the child close. "Of course, darling. We'll make it spectacular." Nathaniel joined them, sliding his arm around Rosalind's waist with comfortable affection. "Happy?" "Profoundly," she said honestly, "though I never imagined this when I first arrived." "No? You didn't envision marrying a difficult duke and reforming his crumbling estate?" "I envisioned survival, perhaps small victories. Never this, never joy." "We built it together," he reminded her. "You, me, Catherine, even your terrifying aunt had a hand in it." Lady Beatrice had indeed taken up residence in the West Wing, where she ruled over Thornwick's social calendar with autocratic efficiency and scared visiting relatives into good behavior. She'd become an integral part of their unconventional family. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "The gossip, the scandal, the difficulty?" Rosalind looked at him. This man she'd helped heal, who'd helped her find purpose and belonging, and felt nothing but certainty. Never. Not for a single moment. He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, while Catherine made exaggerated sounds of disgust and ran off to continue planning her party. The afternoon sun warmed them, birds sang in the restored gardens, and Thornwick Hall stood solid and beautiful against the Yorkshire sky. They'd built something real here. Not the fairy tale perfection of storybooks, but the messy, complicated, authentic happiness of people who'd survived darkness and chosen each other anyway. And that, Rosalind thought, was more than enough. It was everything. If you've been listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has travelled. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Thornwick Hall, where a governess hired to tame a broken estate found something far more precious, a family to call her own.